Thank you so much for coming. I'm Lucinda Smith. I'm the Director of the Environmental Services Department, and I'm really glad to see so many people turn out to talk with us about community greenhouse gas goals and the energy future for this community. Both globally and nationally, cities do play a leading role in efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know that over half the world's population lives in cities, and their cities have the ability to influence a lot of aspects of our emissions and also affect our quality of life, both now and in the future. We are really fortunate to have with us tonight 3 speakers from Copenhagen who are going to be talking with us about their journey and their commitment to reduce their carbon emissions. So right now, I'd like to turn it over to Bruce Hendy, Bruce is, if you don't know, the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Fort Collins, and he'll introduce our speakers from Copenhagen.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's really pretty exciting to see you here. This is kind of Net Zero Cities Week for us. And I think, as you all probably know, the first edition of Net Zero Cities happened last year, and we're really thrilled to have the opportunity to bring that back again, and especially thrilled to have our friends from Copenhagen here tonight to have an opportunity to speak with us. We've had a long-standing back and forth kind of dialogue with Copenhagen, including sending folks from Fort Collins to Copenhagen to find out the great work that you're doing. And so now we have a chance to have them here and to visit with us and for us to hear a little bit about what they're doing. The timeliness of this is really terrific because, as Lucinda mentioned, John and Lucinda and Steve Katnack in our utilities department have been working hard on developing, together with our energy board, I should say, we've got some energy board members here tonight, with what our greenhouse gas goals should be looking into the future and how does that influence our climate action plan. So the opportunity to have Copenhagen share their ideas and their thoughts, what's kind of driven them over the years, I think is especially exciting for us. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. First is Stefan Nielsen, who is the head of the International Clean Tech Network at Copenhagen Capacity. You want to raise your hand? Thank you, Stefan. And also Rune Rasmussen, head of department, Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster. Sorry, thank you. And then Sean Norgard Madsen, who is the Municipality of Copenhagen Senior Advisor, Urban Development and Green Growth. Do you want to? Yep, thanks. Let me just give a little bit of bio on each one of them. Stefan was part of a founding ICN, the International Clean Tech Network, in 2009, and now handles overall project management of the ICN together with his team in Copenhagen. Previously, he worked as business development manager in Copenhagen Capacity, assisting foreign companies with business development, establishing activities and investing in Danish clean tech entrepreneurs. Rune is heading the service secretariat in the Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster. His main responsibility is administration of the 20 micro euro structural fund project, which funds the bulk of services in the CCC. He previously worked as the European Union lobbyist in Brussels for 5 years before joining the Green Growth Department at the City of Copenhagen. Stefan holds last is Søren, who has extensive experience in developing tools and best practice within these fields. His recent focus has been on the synergy creation between smart cities initiatives, carbon neutrality, and urban planning. His skills are with collaborating across sectors with private and knowledge partners, and that's given him a strong in-depth knowledge on what Copenhagen needs in order to succeed with its ambitious goals. So with that, I'd like to welcome the Copenhagen team and to do your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, it'll only be me that will do the presentation today, but afterwards, when you have questions, Stefan and Rune will be here to answer some of them. My name is Søren Nørgaard Madsen, and I work at the City Hall of Copenhagen in the finance administration in a team called Green Growth and Partnerships. And we have a responsibility for doing the overall and strategic plannings for the whole city of Copenhagen. In Copenhagen, we have a strange system. We have 7 mayors with each have their own silo of expertise, and in the finance administration, we are trying to make all these administrations work together in a smart and good way. Yeah, I'll start with this picture. It's a couple of guys you probably know. The picture is from Copenhagen in 2009, December 2009, where we held the COP15 in Copenhagen. All nation-state leaders trying to find a solution for the climate challenges in the world, but they did not succeed. At the same time as this meeting was held, it's like 10 minutes from the City Hall in Copenhagen, we gathered 80 to 100 mayors from big cities around the world at the City Hall, who managed to find out some solution on how cities could help to solve some of these climate challenges. I'll get back to that a little bit later on. First of all, I'd like to give some facts about Copenhagen. You might not know where Copenhagen is, but it's in the northern part of Europe, Scandinavia. It's the capital of Denmark. We have a population around 1.5 million, and in the municipality itself, there's a population of 560,000, and that's the area where I work. Our climate in Copenhagen is mild and wet summers and cold, wet, and windy winters. We like to name ourselves the World Bicycle Capital of the World, and today 55% of the population inside the municipality of Copenhagen commute by bike every day. Thank you. In the greater Copenhagen region, it is 33%, so it's still quite good. Copenhagen is a harbor city. It's laying out to the sound of Øresund, and Sweden is just 10 kilometers on the other side of the sound. Just to give an idea, it's like Copenhagen is 2 hours flight from London and Helsinki and the central part of Europe. This will just to introduce how we think in Copenhagen. This is actually what we also call the Copenhagen story or strategy. First of all, we have a global view. We like to share our ideas, and we like to learn from the best. So we are really interesting to be a part of the Net Zero conference as well, to learn some new things. And the other thing is the user involvement. I think it's great that you have this meeting tonight, and we're trying to have the same kind of meetings in Copenhagen, and we also required to, by law, to involve the public in our planning. So when we are having larger plans, we always have to make these public meetings and hearings. So, but we try to involve the citizens as much as possible, and also companies and universities, so on. But as we see it in Copenhagen, we have 3 overall themes we always think about. One of the most important things for a good city life is, of course, the quality of life in the city. We need to have a safe city, diverse city. There should be leisure, convenience. A healthy city is important as well. But we also need growth to have quality of life. And sustainability is in Copenhagen very important and has been for many years. And we also want to make sure that the growth we have in Copenhagen is sustainable. So all of these 3 things are interconnected, and we always try to think them into our planning as much as we can. The climate challenge is a global challenge, as you probably already know. What we think in Copenhagen is that city plays a crucial role to solve these problems. We do not believe that the nation states have the guts and the power to deliver in this case. So we think that cities has to take over and show the way forward. In Copenhagen, we have an ambition that we should be carbon neutral by 2025. At the same time, we have a quite large population growth on 20% until 2025. That means 105,000 more Copenhageners in 2025. So we have to decouple the carbon emission from the population growth. That is, of course, a challenge, but we will take that challenge. And we already reduced our carbon emission by 20% since 2009, and that was actually our goal for 2015. So we think that we are on the right track until now. But maybe the last 80% will be even harder. We'll find out. We see this, the climate challenge, we see it as a possibility as well. We have here you see a picture of the harbor in Copenhagen. The harbor in Copenhagen was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. This picture was not possible. The harbor was really, really polluted. But we managed to make a plan for this area, to clean up the harbor. And today we have 5 harbor baths along the harbor side, where the Copenhageners can go to swim and to enjoy life. In the climate plan, we think it's important to think smart. We have we think that we should focus a lot on building up a new digital infrastructure in Copenhagen. We have a lot of data in the city, but until now we have not been able to use it in the right way. But we're getting more and more adapted to use these data, and we think that a digital infrastructure in 2013 is like building canals 300 years ago or a highway 40 years ago. Today we need a digital infrastructure. So we are trying to solve this problem together with a lot of companies and together with the Copenhagen Cleantech cluster. And it's a really interesting work we're doing right now on this. We have to work more efficient in the city and use the municipalities' resources in a smarter way. So when we think, as said, that we have 7 different administrations, and we have to make these 7 administrations work together, so that when we solve a problem, we solve more than one problem at the same time. Of course, it's important to involve. We know, as a city, we cannot do this by ourselves. We need help from the citizens. We need help from businesses, and that's why we are trying to work out new ways to make partnerships and involve companies. And we invite companies to come to Copenhagen to use the city as a testbed for new solutions, for new sustainable and smart solutions. Yeah, it's important to find new innovative and technology-based solutions. And as I told you, we want to solve more than one problem when we are making a new solution. This is actually the table of content for our climate plan. Unfortunately, I haven't got any climate plans because our luggage is still somewhere between Copenhagen and Denmark. So I would like, but we have a link in the last slide. We have 4 themes in our climate plan that we focus on. We have energy consumption, we have energy production, mobility, and the city administration. Until now, we managed to involve more than 200 stakeholders in this work, and we're having more than 47 projects on track already now. I will walk through all these initiatives so you'll get an idea on what they contain. First of all, energy consumption. Our major goals for 2025 is a 20% reduction in heat consumption in the city, and a 20% reduction of electricity consumption in commercial and service companies, and a 10% reduction of electricity consumption in normal households. And the city can should also install some more solar cells. How would we do this? The main initiatives we are planning is improvement of the building structures and conditions. In Copenhagen, most of the buildings are more than 50 years old, actually. So it's a really old building stock, and mostly it's apartments, not that many detached housing. So we need to make a strategy for reducing the energy consumption in these older houses, and make a plan for retrofitting these buildings. Yeah, as I told you, we work a lot with smart city initiatives, and finding new ways to use data to make buildings, for example, more energy efficient. For energy production, that is actually the really big part of getting carbon neutral. It stands for 74% of the reduction of carbon, and one of the most important parts is switching from the coal and oil into biomass and electricity production by wind power. We have a district heating system in Copenhagen. Today it is 98% of the whole city is covered by district heating. So, and it's a quite efficient system, especially when we change into biomass and to more wind power. We have to separate plastic waste to make a more efficient incineration of waste, and we have to make biogasification of organic waste. The main initiatives is we need to put up more than 100 wind turbines before 2025, which is quite difficult inside the city. Until now, I guess we have like 10 outside the harbor side, and we are planning on we're opening 5 new ones next year. So we still need more than 85. And there's this not in my backyard attitude towards wind turbines, of course, because they are noisy and very big today. They're getting bigger and bigger. So we have to find solutions for this, and it's not easy, to be honest. One of the other main initiatives is that we have to switch the production of heat and power into be based on biomass instead of coal and oil. And we also have some opportunities to use geothermal heat. Mobility. The major goals for 2025 here is that by 2025, 75% of all trips in Copenhagen are on foot, by bike, or by public transport. That 50% of trips to work or school in Copenhagen are by bike. And this is for the greater Copenhagen region. So that's quite ambitious. Today the number is 33%. So we really have to nudge people to use their bike. And what we are doing are, of course, building very nice and broad cycle lanes, and they are separated from the other traffic, from heavier traffic like car traffic. And actually many places when we have the green lights there's an advantage for the bicycles. So we're trying to make it really, really, really good to go by bike in Copenhagen. And we're investing a lot of money in this bike infrastructure. And actually, Copenhagen has been investing in the biking infrastructure for 40 years. So that's why it's so good today. We have to make 20% more passengers use the public transport system. And what we're doing right now is we're building a second leg of our metro system. We're building a circle ring inside the city center and connecting the city center with the 2 existing lines. And it's a really efficient system. And I guess we will, when we are developing new urban areas, we will also connect them with the metro system. Then we have a goal of that 20 to 30% of all light vehicles should run on new fuels like electricity, hydrogen, biogas, or bioethanol. That's also ambitious. We only have like 200, 300 electric EVs today, so there's a long way to go still. And 30 to 40% of all heavy vehicles should use new fuels. Here's some of the main initiatives. We still want to develop our biking system, even though it's already really great. What we're doing right now is building cycle super highways, as we call them. So you can go from the suburbs to the city center of Copenhagen on a highway for bikes. And I guess we're building, the longest one is 30 kilometers long, and people are actually using it to commuting. And of course, the workplaces have their own bath section, so you can take a shower when you get there. It's important to make a wider use of the public transportation system as well. And what we're doing is building a new metro, but we're also experimenting with the new types of buses. And right now we have 10 different kind of new buses, more attractive buses, driving around Copenhagen to test if they will attract more passengers. We have a problem with getting men into buses in Copenhagen. It's only for today. It's for women and children, for some reason. But the men, they like to use the metro system. So we have to get men to use the buses. ITS, or Intelligent Traffic Management, is also important. It's part of the smart city scheme as well, and trying to find out how to make the green lights more efficient and to reduce the surge traffic for parking lots and so on. This is what we can do in the city. We must be front runners in this case. And today we're switching all our cars into EVs and hydrogen cars, and in the technical and environmental administration, they only have EVs and hydrogen cars today. It's quite interesting, and we are changing our street lights. We just had a big tender. I finished a big tender last week, and we're now changing half of the city's street lighting into a more energy efficient system. And of course the city owns a lot of buildings, and we have to retrofit these buildings to show the way forward for others. And this is the calculation. As you can see, the really big initiatives are wind turbines and new renewable based on the combined heat and power productions. But you also see public transport and city for cyclists are quite big. We still need to manage to find the last. The black one is called new initiatives, and that's the one we do not know yet. So we have to find some new solutions, and that's why we are welcoming companies to come to Copenhagen to test these solutions. We think this is ambitious, but realistic though. And this is what we're doing. We are already invested from the city of Copenhagen. We invested 0.6 billion euros, which is around 0.8 billion dollars. This leads to some more private investments in retrofitting and building wind turbines. The utilities are a big part of this, and they are the ones who are building the combined heat and power production plants and the wind turbines. And we believe that this will lead to even more private investments, indirect investments in new cars, new, more energy efficient buildings, and retrofitting of older buildings. Yeah, and this is the calculation more in detail. And as you can see, that the biggest part is the private investments in new build, which will have a really, really high energy standard. The implementation, we already had the first 2 budgets in place with these $0.8 billion in the budget negotiations and the budget deal for 2013 and 2014 in the city. And we, as I told you before, we have 47 projects under implementation already. Partnerships and clusters. We're having very, very close collaboration with the Copenhagen Cleantech Cluster, Rune and Stefan. And we also search a close collaboration with the universities in Copenhagen. We have in the area of the greater area of Copenhagen, we have 11 universities, and we would very much like to involve them in development of these solutions and testing new solutions. And we also work very close together with the private companies of different kinds, architects and so on. This is what we think you need to do when you want to have an ambitious plan as this. You need, of course, commitment, and by that we mean a strong political commitment in the city council. And in Copenhagen we managed to get all parties to vote for the climate plan, from the far right to the far left. And of course you need to support the plan with the finances. That's the most important thing. You need collaboration. That means a broad stakeholder involvement with the companies, with citizens and universities and so on. And we need to find a new ways to make partnerships with companies and universities, citizens. Coordination, of course, that's important, but communication is really important as well. And that's what we're doing to the citizens, saying thank you for being so green. That's important for us, because what we get is a lot of awards for being a green city. Next year we're having the European Green Capital Award, which is an award from the European Commission, and we will celebrate this with the citizens of Copenhagen all next year. And Copenhagen was awarded the most livable city in 2013 by the Monocle, and of course we are very proud of this. So we still have to work hard to stay up there, and we'll try our best for doing that.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really inspiring, and I was impressed by ambitious but realistic. You make it look easy, and I'm sure I know there was a lot of work behind it.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Michelle Betzel. I'm a political scientist at Colorado State University. And I wondered if you could talk more about partnerships. And you talked about finding new partnership models, if you could sort of elaborate on that. And of the 47 projects under implementation that you talked about, what role are partnerships playing? And can you give us some examples of what those look like?
Okay. One partnership we are doing right now, maybe Rune could explain that, is a tender on a digital infrastructure for the city. And actually we use the Copenhagen Cleantech clusters a lot to get connected to companies, and sometimes also to use them as translators between the city, the municipality, and the companies, so we understand each other much better. But Rune, would you say a few words on the tender and how we work with the?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just an example. I think sometimes the city, I don't know how it works here, but the city, it's very hard for the city to work with individual companies because of this whole state aid issue. So by actually, they can work with 10 companies, with 5 companies, but when it comes down to one company, it becomes complicated. So we as a cluster organization, we are very much this interface in between the city and the companies. And one way we do this is that we are clean tech cluster widely. We don't focus on one technology. Rather, we take up one particular problem. So we try to solve, the data infrastructure. You also saw there was one issue of getting plastics out of waste. Because what Søren didn't tell you is that we incinerate most of our waste, and 50% of the district heating in Copenhagen is from the heat from the incineration. So it means that basically we get a lot of our heat from our waste. The thing is, the waste is perceived to be carbon neutral except for the plastic. So we need to get the plastic out. And it's very easy to get the plastic out, you can just sort it out. But the problem is it's expensive, and used plastic doesn't have a value. So the city comes to us and say, can you solve this? Can you make sure we get the plastics out of waste, but in a way that is economically viable, that we can actually make money on it? And so it's kind of like, well, we don't know the solution, so we get companies on board to try to figure out how can we do this. And it's a very, very long process. But the whole idea is to see, can we use the information from the companies and still get the city on board without those same companies getting excluded from the tender once it's out there. So that's the process we facilitate. We do that on the data as well. So we have basically run a platform to say, how can we best build up a digital data infrastructure? And then we do the actual tendering of the system, but on behalf of the city and some other partners. So that's one example.
Mange tak for coming.
Mm-hmm.
So the solar radiance in Copenhagen is so much lower than here. It's about 1/4, 25% of what is here. And of course in the winter there's almost no solar radiance. So can the solar panels justify their expense? The goals for the solar panels?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually we only calculate that the solar panels will be 1% of the reduction. And of course, it's not as effective in Copenhagen as in Boulder, for example, or in Fort Collins. So we discuss that a lot, and I guess we do not have an agreement in the city in the finance administration and between the finance administration and the technical and environmental administration on if this is a good idea to spend a lot of money on solar panels.
Since the price is about 40 US cents per kilowatt, it's quite expensive. So in that sense, even with the limited sun, it's still a decent business case. Mm. Yes.
And actually, we're also doing district cooling now, where we're using the water from our harbor to cool down office buildings. So, and it's much more energy efficient than air condition.
In the United States in general, about half of our carbon pollution comes from the combination of automobiles and coal-burning power plants. And so with automobiles, since that's an individual item or a company item, we can kind of address that in one way. But what's more difficult is addressing it at the power plant level, because those are centralized, by and large in the US, those are centralized operations, either publicly or mostly privately owned. So I was wondering how in Copenhagen, I'm not sure how your electricity is generated there, the non-renewable electricity, but for the non-renewable electricity, which I assume is coal or oil, how are you going to be working with the power generators, the utilities, whether they're public or private, for them to become collaborators in the process of removing carbon from their outputs?
Actually, the utilities, some of them are owned by the municipalities in the capital region. So we have certain influence on how they should work, you can say. And so we're trying to give them incentives to switch into biomass and to build wind turbines. So actually, I don't know if you can say more about it, Rune.
Well, it's just to mention also waste incineration is actually quite a big. That's a big part of it, especially the heat, but also of the electricity. So it's. But as Søren say, it's not directly controlled by the city, but it's almost directly controlled. So that makes it a lot easier.
I'm Kevin Cross with a group called the Fort Collins Sustainability Group. And I was interested that you said that in Copenhagen, members of all political parties from the extreme right to the extreme left, you have extremes there, were in support of this really amazing goal. Here, of course, as you know, there's not a shared perspective that it's important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by all political persuasions. I'm curious whether there are differences between right and left in terms of why they support that goal. And I'm also curious how the position of all political parties might have evolved to come to this shared perspective that it's important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I guess that for the left-wing parties, this is fundamental to think sustainable in a green way, and I guess for the more, I did not say extreme right, I think, but far right parties, I guess they have now seen that green growth is important for Copenhagen, and it's actually in the green sector that there's the most growth, economic growth in Copenhagen this year. So I guess that the economy helps a lot to make these right-wing parties adapting this plan. But at the same time, they think that the car plays a more important role and should have better conditions in the cities. So there are also some differences. But when they had to vote for the climate plan, they all voted for it. So
I have been in Copenhagen several times, and it's like a dream because the bike lanes, the pedestrian sidewalks are separated, and I've wondered, were the bike lanes and this all laid out a long time ago? Because to retrofit that into cities is quite difficult.
Yeah, I think I also mentioned that before, but I think 100 years ago we also had a quite good bicycle infrastructure in Copenhagen. So I guess it has been easier for Copenhagen to upgrade this already existing infrastructure than it would be for a city to make this infrastructure from the ground. And it has been a really long and strategic work on making it a bicycle city.
But also guess this said that 100 years ago it was, I think it's for the last 15 years or 20 years that things has really taken off. So it has been a very deliberate political decision in Copenhagen to do this. So some of the bicycle lanes, they were already there, but they have been expanded, and it has been a really deliberate choice to do it. And obviously it's always a fight, but there's actually a Danish company with us here, and they do temporary bicycle lanes. Because what they've figured out is that it's very hard to get permanent bicycle lanes in there. Everybody complains. The pedestrians, they say, "We don't take our space." The car says, "Don't take our space." So everybody's kind of complaining. They don't want the space to be taken. But the thing is, once there is a bicycle lane, everybody's happy. So so what they do is they do temporary lanes, and they say almost 100% they becomes permanent. But it's a kind of like, why don't you try it out? And you try it out, and it becomes permanent. So it's a good way to kind of to start out. And I think one of the differences is that bicycles perceive it to be dangerous if it's just painted on the street. Then, cars will go over it. If there's just a small, can be an inch or 2 inches, kind of, it goes up, like the car stays where they are. So you just feel much more safe and that's what they do. They build like a real kind of bicycle lane with the little, and it's funny what it takes sometimes. There's a lot of psychology in it, but it seems to work.
They stop at the lights, then they all go when the bike light goes, and it's not like that here.
Yeah, but I guess that people are using the bike as a tool every day. So of course it's very organized, and we even have bike jams on our cycle lanes, and so that's why we're still investing in making them even more broad and better. So yeah.
Thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge. And I just had a quick question. I was wondering what kind of biomass you guys were actually using, and if that was involved in generating the bioethanols.
It's mostly from agricultural waste, so straw. Like we have a big agricultural sector in Denmark still. So straw and a little bit of wood, and then wood pellets, mostly.
No, it was on the ethanol part. There's been a lot of tests on turning like second generation biomass into ethanol, and also household waste, like the organic parts of household waste into bioethanol, because it has, as you know, you can then store it, but it also sorts out all the plastic, the waste, the metal, and the glass, for instance. So as a sorting mechanism, but also for more efficient. And there's been a lot of tests, and they have been very, very fruitful, but they scale bad. So if you have any kind of systems that can scale, we're very open to this, because there's been some 10-to-1 demonstration sites work beautifully. They just don't. We can't get them to scale well.
Well, thank you so much. Let's give another hand to our speaker and speakers. Definitely, what you're doing in Copenhagen is really inspirational, and so thank you so much for sharing this with us. And we'd just like to transition now for 30 minutes or a little bit less to talk about Fort Collins. We'll go briefly over some background history. I think probably most of this audience is familiar with it. Then talk about some potential goal alternatives here for us in Fort Collins. And then we'll, as I said, at the end have an opportunity for some discussion, and hopefully our guests from Copenhagen will be willing to participate as well. Fort Collins has a variety of assets that help us make progress on our various goals, including environmental and sustainability goals. One is a community commitment to sustainability that is reflected through policies that the Council has adopted, and also citizen views, which I'll share with you in a minute. We also, I believe, have that organizational leadership within the city of Fort Collins plays a really important role in helping us move forward. We have very clearly articulated goals for both customer service and creating and enhancing a culture of innovation, and it's especially the innovation aspect that I think really can help us figure out how to further reach out and work with stakeholders and partners. And so partnerships is the last but probably most important asset that we have. We cannot reach our goals without partnering with the community. The city organization cannot do it, and I don't think any one organization or individual could do it alone. We often refer to partnerships here as the triple helix, which we refer to as the academic sector that can bring in research, expertise, exploration, and innovation, the private sector, which among other things can provide capital and funding, and then the public sector, which can set and provide policy direction and also assist with some piloting of ideas and concepts. So here's a quick look at a 2011 survey results. This was a survey of Fort Collins citizens, 30% response rate. And of these results, in addition to what's shown here, 79% of citizens believe that global warming is human caused, and In addition to that, this particular diagram shows a compilation of, I think, 40 different questions that give a perspective on environmental aspects. And the respondents were broken into 3 categories: advocates, supporters, and skeptics. And based on these data, it would say that over half of Fort Collins citizens are advocates for the type of work that we're doing. They strongly agreed that the earth is getting warmer. They have strong personal responsibility to change their own behavior and believe that government has an important role in helping us make progress. So one of the policy examples that I think reflects a commitment to sustainability is our community greenhouse gas goal policy and the supporting climate action plan. This was last adopted in 2008, but the community actually first began working on climate protection back in the mid-90s and adopted a first goal and plan in 1999. Our current goals are twofold. We have a near-term goal in 2020 to achieve 20% reduction, and our baseline year is 2005, more recent and therefore not as aggressive as 1990 because our emissions have grown a lot since 1990. The longer-term goal that we currently have as adopted policy is 80% below 2005 by 2050, and these are the same goals that exist at the state level in the State Climate Action Plan. So now I'd like to turn it over to John Phelan. He's the Energy Services Manager for the Fort Collins Utilities, and he's going to share some information about the energy policy and some progress that we've made.
Thanks, Lucinda. And it's very nice to see everyone turning out here this evening, and it was also nice to hear some of the common threads that I think are already kind of teasing out as you talked about how cities can be the kind of the core point of innovation for tackling some of these challenges. So, Lucinda mentioned our climate action plan as sort of a foundational element of our climate goals. A second piece is our energy policy. When it first was crafted we've had 2 versions so far in 2003 and 2009, really first focused on our role as a municipal electric utility. And we're very fortunate to have the kind of local decision-making authority we have through being able to manage our own utility as a community. But the areas around that were focused on reliability, a strong focus on efficiency and conservation as sort of a no regrets piece of any policy that we would want to pursue around energy, expanding renewable energy, and again, the piece of partnership comes up again. I wanted to talk through a couple of examples, I think, of key initiatives that are going on. One is Fort Z, Z standing for Zero Energy District, of course. I expect many of you have heard about the initiative. I think it's most powerful to think about it as, in many ways, a quantitative goal around setting up the district itself, qualitative in terms of how we are going about our way of business, and experimental also, in that it becomes the testbed, the area where we can really try out these ideas and innovative concepts to see what works. We're doing that through technology, through looking at new business models, and partnership yet again. So key partners in this are the same ones that Lucinda was talking about. And we're also experiencing something that our friends from Copenhagen talked about, the challenges of being a municipal organization and working in the private sector, and how does that interface, how can we make that work to the greatest benefit? And this is an area where we could really test that out and try it out. A couple of other major initiatives that we've been working on this year. First is our Fort Collins solar program. This is a new business model for us to be able to purchase with long-term agreements solar that's installed locally here within our distribution system in our community. It's based on a feed-in tariff type of model that perhaps Germany is most famous for. I believe I know we're the first in Colorado and one of just a handful in the country. But we'll be able to about quadruple the amount of solar. But perhaps more importantly is to establish the business model and the methodology for how we might be able to pursue distributed generation and renewable energy as we move forward. Another foundational piece is our advanced meter program. So we have pretty much completed the installation of two-way communicating electric and water meters throughout the community that can provide a new window of information for consumers to be able to understand their own energy use, as well as to manage the system as it becomes more and more complex, being distributed and interactive compared to what we have now. So these are kind of foundational pieces. We're just at the beginning of taking advantage of these, but important steps nonetheless. Related specifically to our progress to date related to those 2005 greenhouse gas goals, we're pretty proud that we've had measurable and documented progress along the way. Our emissions in 2012 were 8.7% below our 2005 baseline. The other two lines you'll see there are we've had population growth in that time of about 13%, and our local economy, as measured by kind of sales and use tax, was up a little over 20%. So we're making progress in spite of being, or not in spite of, in combination with being a thriving and healthy community where people want to come and live. Two key elements of that are our strong efficiency programs and the beginnings of more and more renewable energy as we add that to our mix. It's not all about energy, though. It's certainly, again, the thread of commonality. The comments about having a healthy, vibrant local economy, a quality of life where people want to live there, those are also elements that we have here in Fort Collins, and we want to make sure and maintain and grow those over time. So in a number of areas, we really have measurable results. Our energy efficiency programs and energy policy programs are saving money. They're reducing the community's electricity bill, natural gas bills. Those funds go into other uses in the community. People do other things with their money. ClimateWise partners on the business side, they report their projects and savings, $14 million in 2012 alone. One of the continual sort of strongest reasons why businesses enjoy participating in ClimateWise is those bottom line benefits that they see. Fort Zed, we're able to demonstrate new technologies. We've received some grant funding from the Department of Energy on a number of projects, and again, making that test bed piece. Let's not forget waste diversion. It's an important piece of our reduction strategies, and again, here there's a job element where doing anything other than landfilling it is going to have a better benefit here in our local job base. Health is also our physical health, our community's health. All of these measures also generate local air quality improvements, be that reduction in our energy use, changes over time in our fuel and resource mix are going to help us maintain our beautiful environment and healthy place to live. I'm going to pass it back to Lucinda now. She's going to talk more about specifically the goals we have moving forward. Be happy to answer any questions on some of the topic areas that I covered.
Thank you, John. So we obviously have a goal and we have made progress, and that's all good news. So why are we here convening to reassess our goals? Well, there are several important reasons, really. Since the climate policy goal was adopted in 2008, scientific information about climate change and the impacts of climate change has continued to emerge. And I think it states an increased urgency that cities around the world address this issue. We also, as John just discussed in his remarks, we have advancing opportunities right within our community. So the advanced meter program, prices of technology are changing. So the price of installed PV has dropped dramatically over the last decade or so. Also, the energy policy, which is another policy that John just mentioned and discussed, is updated on a 5-year cycle. So it was last adopted in 2009, and 2013, 5 years later, means it is being looked at again. And so as we examine the energy policy, it's almost in some ways part and parcel of our greenhouse gas goals. And then we also have other important planning initiatives that are going on this year as well. One of them being taking a look at our waste stream. And there's a Road to Zero Waste planning process. Susie Gordon in our department is heading that up. And there's been a lot of public outreach about that. And that actually is bringing in additional information in terms of opportunities and strategies that we can look at to reduce the waste sector. So we definitely have both challenges and opportunities ahead of us, no question about that. climate change is impacting us now here in Fort Collins. And the intent of this presentation is not to make that case. We have many experts in Fort Collins who are able to do that. But clearly we are impacted by climate change, and we all know the impacts of the recent fires that have happened in the last couple of years along the Front Range. It's interesting to note that each of those fires, the High Park, the Waldo Canyon, and the Black Forest, started on days of high temperature, 2 of those being either record tying or record breaking. In terms of the economy, we are moving out of the recession, and that's great news. By some counts, we anticipate that there could be over $1 billion worth of construction activity, though, already planned in Fort Collins over the next decade. So that brings with it really important choices. How are we going to build our community, our buildings, and our infrastructure? And Soren, you mentioned the built environment, your existing buildings. Well, over 50% of our community greenhouse gas emissions come from the residential and commercial sector, which now is comprised of existing buildings. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, I think, and increased efficiency we can realize there. And although it's not visible, we really are, in some ways, at an energy crossroads. The next decade or so will be very telling in terms of where we go as a community and as a region in terms of our energy source and the way we can create both opportunity and resiliency in our community. So those are the reasons why we're looking at the goals now. Goals also are important because they can focus and catalyze action within a community. And they can engender ownership if they were developed collaboratively with the community. And I was so impressed to hear in Copenhagen how you had all the stakeholders participating, and it sounded like there really was a good sense of ownership. And that's what we're starting this process now with, to hear your voices. Also, setting goals, if they're truly embraced by elected officials, can help identify and remove barriers, and then certainly it can help elicit resources and funding to help achieve those goals. So leading cities around the world have greenhouse gas reduction goals. The bottom picture here is Chicago, the top right is Portland, and the top left is Copenhagen. And here are just a couple of examples of leading cities' goals. There are a number of cities who have actually set a carbon neutral goal, which is very, very ambitious. There are a number who've set an 80% reduction by the year 2050, but note that their baseline year is 1990, which is reflective of Kyoto protocols, and in Fort Collins we're looking at 2005. There's a poster in the back that lists a whole range of global cities and their greenhouse gas goals. So I know this is too elementary for this audience, I apologize, but very quickly, when we're talking about goals, there are different aspects to them. The scope, what are we going to measure when we set a goal? And in Fort Collins, we follow the ICLEI community protocol. And so what we measure in our greenhouse gas inventory is electricity production and use, emissions from ground travel, natural gas burned within the community, emissions from air travel, organic emissions associated with solid waste sent to the landfill, and then there are some process emissions associated with wastewater treatment. So that's the scope. The boundary is determined, in our case, pretty much around the Fort Collins city limits, with the exception of the air travel and even the emissions in the landfill, which are produced, the waste is produced in Fort Collins, but it goes into the landfill. Then the other two aspects that are more in question are magnitude and time frame. So how much reduction by when? This is what our current goals look like, and this is what we're really talking about. So we've identified 3 alternative goals to look at moving forward. And the first one, and these are long-term goals, not what the interim goal would be. The first one is keeping our current goal. That is to seek 80% reduction below 2005 by 2050. And if we look at, we know we aren't going to achieve an annual average reduction, that the reduction will change over time. But on average, we'd have to reduce our emissions 1.8% per year to achieve that goal. The next alternative, alternative B, is to set a goal for carbon neutral by 2050. And the reductions needed would obviously escalate to a 2.2% annual reduction required for that. The third goal is to accelerate the time frame, to keep our reduction objective at 80%, but to move that 20 years forward up to 2030. And that would require the most aggressive annual change. And then we can look and see that historically, on average, we've achieved 1.2% reduction. So that's, we think it's reasonable to have kind of a null hypothesis, which is the current goal, and then two other aggressive alternatives. This is a look at what they would look like just represented pictorially. That black line there shows what our emissions trend has been. This gray dashed line here shows projected growth from 2012, and that does include some aspects of anticipated programs already. For example, I believe the projected growth does include the benefits of the federal fuel efficiency standards. The other interesting thing about this graph is if we take our average reduction that we've achieved thus far from 2005 to 2012 and project it on out, although we are on track for our 2020 goal, we're not currently even on track for our 2080 goal. So, you know, that's just something to keep in mind as we look at this. Now, this chart I know might be overwhelming, and I know you can't see the numbers, but even if you can just see the color differences, that alone is relevant. This was an analysis done by the Brendel Group, and as I mentioned, they're working with us to help identify some of the alternatives and begin to assess some of the pathways for achieving them. So I briefly want to explain these series of pie charts. The brown segments all represent fossil-related emissions, whether it be for electricity or natural gas. And the blue sectors, or the blue segments, represent renewables. So you can see that in 2005, 50% of our emissions were from fossil fuel combustion for electricity. If we look at the top goal alternative here, which is our current goal, it would suggest that by 2050, what you see here, this is the dotted circle around it and a smaller pie. That pie has shrunk by 41%, which means that just we would hope to reduce our emissions through efficiency, just to reduce and shrink the whole pie by 41%. With what's remaining, we would anticipate getting around 2/3 of that generated by renewable energy, renewable electricity, and then there still would be some fossil fuel emissions. The second alternative here, same general concept, out by 2050, we would hope to reduce the total consumption 41%. We'd have about still, again, 2/3 generated from renewable electricity, 8% approximately from renewable natural gas, so biogas generation, and then somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/4 of the emissions would have to be accounted for by either overproducing renewable energy or acquiring carbon offsets or renewable energy certificates. And carbon offsets could be envisioned as something that would even be invested in locally or regionally, either to help our ecosystem or to have more renewable energy within our community. So if we set a carbon neutral goal, we will need to offset some of our emissions, and that's an important part of the discussion. So when we look at the goal alternatives, I'll tell you honestly that I anticipated we would be able to flesh out the differences between these three more fully, but as we look at them, there's a fair amount of similarities between them. They are all ambitious. All of them will move beyond simply efficiency into pretty significant change in energy source and renewables. None of them yet have a strategic action plan developed. All of them will require near-term investments, and based on some economic analyses that have been done and are still in progress, all of them are anticipated to deliver net savings to our community by 2050. So that period of 2030 to 2050 is important when we start seeing the savings pay off. But there are also some differences that we can articulate even at this beginning point. One is probably in the leadership positioning. There is great value in having a goal, and sometimes stating a truly ambitious goal will attract resources. Another one, as I mentioned, was the use of carbon offsets, and then clearly the rate of investment and payback is something that will be distinguish the goals and that will be worked on more as we do some of the planning. So I was very interested in your presentation, Soren, to see the difference in the relative percent of the 1% public investment and then 9% direct private and 35 or something indirect private. Basically, there are a whole variety of financing models that we could look at. Some of these approaches are more suited to certain strategies than others, but we'll be looking at all of them. And this ranges from, large-scale private investment through venture capital, small-scale private investment of individuals who choose to invest in their home. There's an energy services company model where, and this already exists at the commercial building sector, where investors pay the capital up front, know they're going to be savings, and they're repaid by the savings. Maybe this model can be broadened out and applied at the sector level. Philanthropy, individual citizen and business contribution, and we actually know that there have been contributions, even for example to complete a grant application for one component of Fort Zed. A small part of that came together through community donations because of interest and commitment to that project. So grants and prizes, public-private partnerships, and then ratepayers. We have a municipal electric utility, and currently our ratepayers do pay for part of the renewables and efficiency programs. And then taxpayer is an approach that's been used elsewhere in the country and the world. These are the questions. Since we couldn't give you detailed planning analyses of the 3 goal alternatives, we really are at the beginning of this conversation. So we thought we would ask the questions, which values do you feel that our community should try to embrace as we move forward? Leadership, risk management, risk management can go in several ways, including the risk of inaction. That's an important risk to consider as well. Collaboration, innovation, no regrets. That's actually a way that the community did move forward with our carbon goals originally in 1999, was very much under a no regrets kind of approach, which basically is, there's so many co-benefits, why wouldn't we do this anyway, even if you don't believe in climate change? Some other questions to just ponder are, what opportunities or sectors should the city focus on? What suggestions for financing models do you have? And also, what other information would you like to see in providing to the City Council alternatives for goals? So our next steps are going to be continuing to work a little bit on fleshing out the alternatives of goals. We will be going around together, both the staff from the Utilities and Sustainability Services to boards and commissions in November and December, and talking with them both about the energy policy, which is being updated, and the greenhouse gas goals. We would be happy to come and speak to your group if you're interested. And there's a work session scheduled, City Council, in January. Council may or may not choose to set a goal at that point. They may choose to ask for more analysis. They may choose to set one because of the leadership opportunity, or they may set the goal through the energy policy or the climate action plan, both of which will be updated. We'll get an input opportunity set up on this website. It's not there yet, but it will be soon, fcgov.com/climate protection. And with that, I guess I'd like to actually introduce Greg Boehm, who is the chair of the Fort Collins Energy Board. And we thought you would be interested in knowing about what the Energy Board is working on in terms of the energy policy. So Greg is coming tonight to just give a little bit of overview on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucinda. Hi, my name is Greg Boehm, and as Lucinda said, I'm this year's chair of the Fort Collins Energy Board. Just briefly for our visitors, as well as a few people in the room who may not be familiar with the Energy Board, City of Fort Collins has almost 30 different citizen volunteer boards and commissions that cover a variety of different topics, but provide advice and input to City Council on whatever their board or commission's specific domain is. The Energy Board was created in 2012. This is its second year. It's the successor to the former electric board. And a couple of years ago, I think City Council looked at the scope of energy issues within the city and decided that the electric board, though important, its mandate was not all-inclusive to cover other aspects of energy and climate, carbon reduction within the city. So they phased out the electric board and replaced it with the energy board. It's a 9-member board, and there's actually at least a couple other members here this evening. And one of our major, probably the largest item on our work item this year has been to work with city staff, utilities, and sustainability services on looking at the current energy policy and working on a revision. As was mentioned earlier, the current policy was adopted in 2009 with a trigger to be reviewed and updated on a 5-year cycle. So we've been working on that all year. We're not finished because a key component of that is integrating it with the greenhouse gas reduction goals of the climate action plan. So that's kind of one of the major topics that we've spent a significant amount of time on, and we're not finished. A few more months worth of work, I think. But if you're interested in the discussions, the Energy Board meetings are open to the public. We meet on the first Thursday of every month at the, let's see, the 117 Mason, that direction, I guess. Just down here on Mason, enter on the west side of the building. So those meetings start at 5:30 p.m. on the first Thursday of the month. I think that pretty well covers. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that before we can complete the review of the energy policy, we need to have a greater understanding of where the city's going to go with the climate greenhouse gas reduction goals, so those can be tightly coupled together. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. And I also want to recognize that there are certainly other boards who will be, weighing in on the greenhouse gas goals and the energy policy. So I know there are several members of the Air Quality Board here tonight. Tonight's actually their meeting night. I think there's at least one Transportation Board member here. And am I missing any other board representatives? Because the other boards who will participate are the Economic Advisory Commission, the Natural Resources Advisory Board. Oh, and I also wanted to just introduce Judy Dorsey and Becky Fedak. If you don't mind raising your hands, please. Okay, they're from the Brendel Group and are helping us, as I mentioned, with some of these analyses. And thank you for being here, too.
Hello, Mike Prisnick, Fort Collins citizen and local business owner. I'll try to phrase my question here. It's kind of complicated, but I guess one of the things I think about is the biggest inhibitor to sustainability is really what I phrase as praying to the god of economics with our carbon blinders on. And kind of what I mean by that is, burning and harvesting fossil fuels, herbicides, pesticides, GMOs, they all have upside potential and downside risk with them. And focusing just on the carbon aspect or even the greenhouse gas, we're missing a whole bunch of the equation. And so for me, I'm really looking for that wider view of it, not just the focus on carbon, but the focus on the other stuff. And there is actually a lot of information out there that suggests that global warming is in part nature. And we need to also be looking at adapting to what nature is going to throw at us, not just mitigating what man does. If we put all our eggs in one basket, that's a big risk. And we need to be looking at both and monitoring both with equal diligence. And then as far as the economic part, I think one of the gentlemen from Copenhagen said it when he said, must be economically viable. And kind of one of the things I like to look at from that point of view is children are a financial liability. They're not economically viable, and yet we all have children. And I bet Bill Gates and Warren Buffett could not offer you enough money for you to harm your child, right? Yet that would be an economically viable decision to accept that money. So I would like to get off this concept of it has to be economically viable. I mean, one of the reasons the government can take taxes is to do those things that aren't economically viable, that a business can't do. And we need to kind of look at it from that point of view. At some point, human rights are important, environmental rights are important, and economics are not as important, and we need to have that priority there. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to express that point of view and hope that will be included in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. I can respond at least to one thing you said, which is that we should be looking at incorporating elements of resiliency and adaptation in our climate action planning, and I very much agree. And we have some work going on that will be going on later this year for the city government organization to look more fully at the risk and vulnerability that we have not only in our utility, which has already been evaluated, but in other aspects of the organization. And I think we would like to bring in, you know, I'm not saying that we're going to be doing a complete community climate adaptation plan, but a lot of strategies have synergy. They both serve to mitigate and adapt, and we would like to highlight those and really think about that. So that's a great comment. Thank you.
Hi. My name is John Calderazzo. I'm a citizen, and I'm a professor at CSU for the last 28 years. I'm also what you call a senior citizen. So I'm interested in the way our young people get engaged in civic activities, even as I'm not a young person myself anymore. And I'm noticing, as I look around the room, that there are not really that many young people here. I mean, 30s and 20s, there are some. And this is an issue that we notice in talks that Sue Ellen Campbell and I have put on about climate change around town. And I was just wondering if there are any ideas that might be out there to figure out ways to engage younger people in the community in some of these decisions, whether that's CSU students, you know, who are here only part of the time, or just younger people that live in town. We know they have a lot of great ideas, they have a lot of great energy, and so forth. And I don't think it's a failing when those things don't happen, but it seems more like a missed opportunity. And I was just wondering if anybody had any ideas of how to increase that kind of activity.
You know, that's a very great question. And we're fortunate, I think, at CSU to have a National Science Foundation funded program called REACH, which I think is going to be reaching out more to the community. And I think that part of that organization also puts on a really robust one-day event for high school students from all over the state to talk about climate change. You know, that's a different way of engaging them through the educational system, but there's so much more we could do. And I'm just curious, in Copenhagen, do you have any response? How did you try to engage youth?
Yeah, well, what we try to do is engaging them through the educational system to make theme weeks at schools and universities. And of course, when we work together with, we have a partnership with the universities, we also invite the students to test some of their ideas in the city. And of course, I think that it's important to use new kind of medias when you want to involve the youth. So use social medias instead of public meetings, maybe.
So maybe I just wanted to add, and it's not to say something bad about the city of Copenhagen, but sometimes young people don't necessarily want to go to a meeting at the city hall. They want to go to a meeting in another forum. So maybe putting it at the universities and the clusters, or the I know you have business plan competitions as well. Mm-hmm. Just integrate that into the city, I think.
Kevin Cross again. You know, one of the things that bothers me a little bit about focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from cities is that the way we measure greenhouse gas emissions doesn't take into account the embodied emissions associated with agricultural products and industrial products that come into our boundaries. So as cities become less and less focused on industry, it becomes easier and easier for cities to meet really aggressive greenhouse gas emissions. I've been involved in, you know, working with the city of Fort Collins to reduce greenhouse gas emissions a lot, largely out of a frustration that the national government hasn't been doing anything, but perhaps that's a little bit of a cop-out. So, Lucinda, I was kind of intrigued by your talk about the use of offsets to meet our goals, and I'm thinking out loud here, which is always a little dangerous, but perhaps it makes sense for cities to set very aggressive goals and then meet those goals with offsets that go to the countryside and other countries perhaps to help the world as a whole reduce its greenhouse gas emissions more? Because that, of course, is what it's all about. It's great if Copenhagen reduces its emissions by 100%, and if Fort Collins reduces emissions by 80%, by whenever. But what really counts is what's happening in the world as a whole. And as we know, emissions for the world as a whole have been going up pretty steadily throughout this time when cities in the United States have seen their emissions going down. So again, intrigued by the idea of offsets to help that process.
Rich Fisher, I'm with the Air Quality Advisory Board, and we also believe we've got a role here on the energy planning for the city. I'd like to expand just a little bit on what was just said about surrounding entities and their impacts on our climate. I would suggest that the partnerships really need to extend to those other entities that do affect the climate in our region, believing that this is not just a city issue, it's at least a regional issue. And in fact, I would suggest that, global climate change really isn't global, it's really regional. We affect our climate locally or regionally a great deal, beginning with, let's say, land use patterns. And in our case, with regard to oil and gas and the emissions from those sources in our area do influence our climate substantially. And so from an air quality point of view, all our surrounding emissions plus our city emissions need to be taken into account, including those kinds of effects that occur to climate from land use planning and land use management.
Well, it was just a comment on the, I thought it was a bit of an unfair comparison to my standpoint on the child abuse comparison there. So I just wanted to take up my point. My point is obviously not to make money on the green if it's kind of like the first thing first. So for instance, on the plastic example, we wanted the plastics out of waste, period. But the thing is, the city played a role, or we kind of played a role on the collaboration part. So one thing we did was actually to go to IKEA and said, if you had any used plastics available, would you use it? And they said, we would love to use it. We would like to wrap all our packages in used plastics if it was available. But not only that, we would actually like to make all our furniture with used plastics in the future. So those plastic handling companies we talked to, they said, we don't want to handle all this waste because nobody wants it. So if we could go to them and say, look, IKEA wants it, if you actually can make it readily available, then it's not about economic viability in its own sense, and it's not about child abuse in any sense. It's simply about using the city powers to get their goals through making a good business case for companies. And if you can combine those two, then it's, in a sense, a beauty, isn't it? That it's not compromising the green goal, it's just to getting private companies to do it for you because it's a good business case to do so. So I think that way of thinking. Also, another example that Søren didn't mention is they cannot force private households to retrofit their buildings. They just can't. And so what they do is they have a good overview of the buildings. So they say, well, we know pretty much these buildings are identical in terms of how they're built and also in terms of ownership. So they tell all the owners, you have similar buildings. Why don't you do a joint tender for retrofitting? That's going to make it a lot cheaper to retrofit everything. They say retrofitting is a good business case already, but if you can tender 5 buildings at the same time, it's beautiful. So in that sense, you make it an even better business case. So you get the companies and the private house owners to do your business case or to do your emission savings for you. So I think that kind of thinking is what goes into Copenhagen's plan. That $1 invested for every 85 in the private sector shows a bit about, it's less about the actual investments from the city, but it's more about the guidance in it. So just to clarify that.
I didn't introduce myself before. My name is Philip Friedman, and I'm actually on the Natural Resource Advisory Board, so there is a member represented here. No problem, Lucinda. And I'm also on the Fort Collins Sustainability Group, along with Kevin and a couple other people that were here. And I was actually going to speak on the collaboration part that the gentleman before me spoke on, but he said it a lot more eloquently, so I'm not going to say that. And I agree with almost everything he said. So I actually wanted to kind of move to adding let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, a sixth bullet there, and that I would call precision and accuracy. And I think having sat on both the Climate Action Task Force in both 1999 and 2008, the first one as a member of the NRAB, the second one as a member of FCSG, we were pretty rigorous, particularly in the second one. And the reason we weren't quite as rigorous in the first one is that we were learning. We were one of the first entities in the entire United States to put forth that type of effort to address climate change at the local level. Remember, this is 1999, and PV cost $15 a watt. Now it costs 63 cents a watt. So that's the major difference that we've had. And our greenhouse gas emissions back then were under 350, and now they're over 400. So, but on that second round, with the help in both times with the Brendel Group, Judy next to me, there was a lot of precision and there was a lot of accuracy in how the data was put forth and how we were going to determine how we were going to measure our carbon impacts and how we were going to, more importantly, measure the impacts of our carbon reductions. And so I would say that that should be added to there as a bullet to maintain that consistency and, in fact, improve upon it almost to the point of a fault. Because without accurate numbers, both in accurate and in precise ways of accounting for those greenhouse gases, both the savings as well as both the savings as well as the outputs that we provide, we don't really know where we are. I think we did a really good job in the last couple of years, unfortunately during the recession, at being able to understand how the recession impacted our community greenhouse emissions. And so we need to be able to keep up that kind of a concept. We need to account for every little thing. Otherwise, we really don't know whether we're doing a good job or not, or where we need to improve. So.
Thanks, Phil. I'd like to just quickly respond that since we did the last climate action plan, we have we've hired a position that is an environmental data analyst that helps us with our greenhouse gas inventory. We have a database, and so we are doing more rigorous accounting, although it's still true that for certain aspects of the inventory, we rely more on certain either older data or assumptions, especially in the area of air travel. But I appreciate that point, and I think it helped even advance the 2008 Climate Action Plan, the level of strategy analysis that was provided and some of the cost estimates. And that is definitely will be part of the next energy policy and climate action planning again, is to figure out alternative pathways and what the various investment and payback scenarios are, and that will help council choose. So thanks for that comment.
Well, I was just curious on your all your little pie charts when you get down to the orange color and you just get some offsets. What the heck is an offset?
A carbon offset is something that is been identified and documented as to its ability to reduce carbon emissions. And it's something that a locality can invest in, an individual can invest in. Just as a very small scale example, there are groups that sell carbon offsets for air travel. So they basically, if you choose to provide them with funding, they use that funding and invest it in a project that will reduce carbon emissions. And sometimes carbon offsets have suffered from, in some cases, a lack of credibility in terms of how well can they be documented, in terms of the ownership and the longevity of the emissions reductions, those types of issues. So there are more and more programs coming into place that provide documentable or verifiable carbon offsets. But the basic concept is that you would pay money to offset the emissions that's occurring here. You pay money and an emissions reduction occurs over there. That was my attempt to explain it. If anyone else would like to have a go at it, please do.
I'm Greg McMaster. One of the hats I wear is Air Quality Advisory Board. And Lucinda and Air Quality Board members and others have heard me say this for a long time, but I think it's important to get it into this discussion. If we look at scientific assessment of climate change starting in the late 80s, early 90s, the certainty that is developing about it, and the seriousness of it continues to be more and more extreme. And it seems to me that we've always been playing catch up and behind the game in our climate action plan. We set goals, and I would say at this point, you have three alternatives: stay the course, or increase the magnitude a little bit, accelerate the time frame. I think all of those aren't far enough. We need to do more. And just to reduce it, say 80% by 2050 from 2005 levels, I think is not going to adequately address it.
My research actually is on how cities respond and deal with climate change and climate policy. And so I'm part of a community of researchers that have studied cities from Fort Collins to Copenhagen to everything in between. And so this is a really interesting discussion, and I'm sort of thinking about this discussion in that broader context. And so two observations. One is there's a pretty rigorous debate, at least in the academic community, of people who study these things about this idea of measuring and monitoring and the focus on measuring and monitoring. And there's, some people will make the argument, like what was made earlier, that, you really need that to know where you are, to be able to have accountability and credibility. Others will say it narrows the focus, and that it becomes, you only focus on those things that you can measure and monitor, and that there may be things that have more indirect or may spur greater innovation down the line, but we can't necessarily measure or monitor the emissions reductions right now. And so, I guess I would just throw that out there to sort of think about the choice to focus on measuring and monitoring and what perhaps is falling off of the radar when you do that. In that same way, the argument has been made that measuring and monitoring tends to focus on, it's all about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And there are people who would say, more broadly, what we need is thinking about decarbonization and all that would entail. And that, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but if we don't fundamentally change all of the systems about how we produce, we use energy, we transport, we think about how we live our daily lives, we're really never going to tackle this problem.
My name's Nancy York, and I'm on the Air Quality Advisory Board as well. But as far as the goals and the values being emphasized, I have long been an advocate that you should lead by example. Mm-hmm. And to that end, and this might even bring in youth who, because they will have hope that something is being done if it is well advertised is not quite the word, but if it's constantly comes from the city government, mm-hmm. if it's a point that is repeated and the steps that are being taken. But one way of leading by example is, for instance, to turn down the thermostat. This is an overheated room. To truly lead by example.
Talking about whether we're going to hit 80% reduction by 2050 or 100% by 2050 or 80% by 2030. I'm all in favor of increasing our aggressive goals toward reducing those emissions, but if Fort Collins stopped all of our greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, that would account for approximately 0.005% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So for me, this is not about the absolute number that we're going to reduce it to. It's more about leadership, what the city of Fort Collins is going to do that is more aggressive than 99% of the cities in the world will attract attention to what we're doing. And it's that synergistic effect of other cities along with Copenhagen and Seattle and on down the list combined that together is the only way we're going to solve the problem. Looking at the numbers, I appreciate all the analysis that goes into it. Don't get me wrong about that. I think it's important to measure it and understand it. But in a certain sense, it all kind of starts feeling sort of like dancing, counting the number of angels dancing on the head of a pin. So anyway, enough about that. Thank you.
Hi, Dan Bin. This is a great forum, so thanks very much for putting this on. A couple of things, if somebody gave me a choice for how to get to 2050, I would say I have no idea what tools I'll have available in 2030. or whether or not I'll even be here for that matter. But it seems like focusing on the next 10 years or 12 years and try to think about how to deal with that is going to be much more. Well, I think our brains are designed to think about that because we know what our tool set is, at least for the next decade, fairly. And so I'd like to see a closer term focus.
I would like to know, both for Fort Collins and Copenhagen, how much are you thinking about the heating and cooling of buildings? And this speaks a little bit to her point because usually the air conditioning is too high for me. So the heating and cooling of buildings, what specifically are you doing in Copenhagen and Fort Collins about that? And I also read that most new apartments being built in Fort Collins have air conditioning.
Great question. I think, as Lucinda noted, buildings account for about half of our overall emissions. And a lot of that is for heating and cooling, and then everything that we put inside of our buildings as well, all the electronics and entertainment and refrigerators and everything else. Buildings change generally over kind of long time frames when we see as people move and rehabilitate and change buildings. So it's a combination of there's some aspects that are addressed by code changes. There are many more aspects that are addressed by sort of voluntary programs and incentives. Some of the ideas about bundling things and finding out sort of faster, simpler, easier delivery models to help people get them done, because those are hard decisions to make. So it's really a whole range of things on making the buildings themselves more efficient, and then making the provision of that heating and cooling as efficient as possible at the same time. But even if we do all of those things, we're still going to have to address the supply side of the equation. So in general, efficiency measures and conservation, no matter where you look in the world, they are the most important thing to always do, but they're not going to get to the kind of goals and numbers that we're talking about here. They're going to help moderate that growth that we're going to see in a thriving community that we have here anyway. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Just very quickly, it's taken very seriously. Of the 85 kind of dollars for every dollar invested, I think 70% of those are going into buildings. So it's in terms of the investments, it's one of the very, very huge impacts in Denmark. And on the cooling side, is we don't use air conditioning very much. I mean, we have it's not, unfortunately, not necessary. Yes, as Søren mentioned, we have some district cooling as well, but it's mostly for data centers and stuff. And the beauty of it is that you can make cooling from the excess heating of the district heating in the summer. When you don't use the heat, you can make it into cooling. So that kind of optimizes the whole system.
My name is Rosemary Russo. I work for the city of Fort Collins, and I just want to address John and Nancy's comment about youth. So PSD now has an elective for sustainability that I helped write a couple years ago, and the class always goes. And Front Range and CSU, they both have great sustainability student groups. And this week we have 3 Make a Difference events. And probably 80% of the people that volunteered on my projects are younger people. So there's a lot of hope in the youth.
Great. Thanks, Rosemary. That actually strikes me as a really positive way to conclude this evening. I want to thank everyone for coming. And I just would like to invite you to join me once again to thank our speakers from Copenhagen very much for coming tonight.